I'm Debbie Dillion. I am the Horticulture Extension Agent here. I coordinate the Master Gardener program. I work with homeowners. I train new Master Gardeners. I really love my job. You can tell I'm getting gray hair, but I'm still hanging in there because I love what I do. I love working with the volunteers. I love working with the public. So it's our pleasure tonight. And this, I call her little girl, excuse me, but she's a mother of two. I think of her as a young woman, and that's what she is, and she is just awesome. Do any of you follow Presley through Renfrow's Hardware? She does a weekly newsletter, and that's how I feel like I know her, because I've watched the pictures of our little girls. So she actually has a degree in mechanical engineering from NC State. But don't y'all all think she's a horticulturist? Seems to me, until I found this out, I thought she had a degree in horticulture. But she's, I guess, learned by hands-on practical experience. And if any of you were at last month's meeting, we had originally planned to do a tour of their farm on July 20th, and she's not going to be in town, so that has been canceled, I'm sorry to say. But we have, we'll have another program August the 3rd. We have Mimi Hernandez for our next successful gardener that will be virtually online through WebEx. And she is an herbalist. And so she's going to talk about creating a native plant sanctuary. So she's a forager. She's into native plants. She's an herbalist. So it should be a really interesting program. So if you didn't pick up a flyer, we've got those on the back table tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Presley and let her take it from here. Presley?
Okay, can y'all hear me all right? Thanks so much for having me, Debbie, and it's my pleasure to be here. This is the first PowerPoint I've made in at least a decade, so if I'm a little rough at the beginning, please bear with me. And as I remember how to use this thing. But I'm Presley, for those of you who don't know Renfrow's. My family owns Renfrow Hardware in downtown Matthews, and I grew up working there. But before we get into all of that story, just quickly, we're going to go through a few different topics today, and at different breakpoints, I would love to answer any questions. So first, I'm just going to give a few-minute introduction as to who we are, and then go through types of flowers, show you lots of beautiful pictures of flowers, and then go through planting and growing, pests and diseases, weather stuff, all those kinds of things. And then at the very end, we'll also...
No camera.
I just heard an echo. Let me know if anything's not working. Okay, so to start with, my parents own Renfrow Hardware. I grew up working there. Actually got on the payroll the first day of 6th grade because you do not count as child labor laws when you are a family member. So I was able to be 11 years old and getting a paycheck. And my favorite thing to do, I worked before and after school every day in middle school. And I loved the seed counter, weighing out seeds for people, and I loved working in the greenhouse, which are still my two favorite places at the store today. Back then, I knew nothing about flowers, though. We grew lots of vegetables. I loved telling every customer who came in that I thought they needed to grow a Cherokee purple tomato plant. But my love for flowers came later. The hardware store is notoriously not open a lot anymore in the semi-retirement phase of my parents and all of the nearing Social Security age employees. But we still love what we do. We love teaching people how to garden. And so we are figuring out how to do it in fewer hours so that we can keep doing it. And then we have a farm, which is what all of these pictures today and all of my experience will come from. I was a sophomore in college when the man who owned the hardware store before my dad, David, passed away. His name was Frank Renfrow, and he lived on 5 acres of land in downtown Matthews. And my dad was basically like a son to him in his old age, being a business partner. And so he left us the farm, well, what we turned into the farm. He left us his home property. It had been a farm in the early 1900s, and my dad had this vision to turn it back into one. And I was halfway through engineering school, not really loving engineering, and thought, oh, well, I'd love to join the family business when I get back, when I graduate, and I would love to do the farm. So my dad spent a couple years getting the property ready. We added deer fencing, took out a bunch of trees, and when I graduated college, I moved home, and a week later was starting farming. And that last summer before graduating, I had planted with my then boyfriend, now husband, and another friend, my very first flower garden patch ever. We had done that because we were beginning to have some bees put on the property, or wanting to have bees, which we now have lots of hives. But at the time when we first started growing, we were noticing that there were no pollinators. The squash was not producing. And so my dad practically was saying, well, we need to grow a lot of flowers to bring the pollinators in. And so I dutifully planted all the flower garden, then went away for the summer, came back to this beautiful garden of zinnias and cosmos and sunflowers, and fell in love with them at that point. I loved harvesting blooms, giving them away to everybody. And so did not plan to become a flower farmer at the outset, but that first winter, once I started farming, I spent lots of time reading flower farming books and decided that I was going to at least start with a lot of flowers. So 6 months later, got engaged. 3 months later, was going to be getting married, and decided, this was mid-June, oh, I'm going to try growing all the flowers for my own wedding. And I'm going to try arranging all the flowers for my own wedding. And in 3.5 months, that's what I did. This was some of the very first flowers that I ever grew. And there's my husband, Matthew, right there. And I stumbled into it and fell in love, and was a bride slash florist for the very first time. So kind of went absolutely head over heels into growing flowers. Those were a bunch of the flowers I harvested a couple days before the wedding, and one of my bouquets. Since then, I've probably done 100 weddings. I have scaled back and don't do them anymore, but over the past 10 years, have done wedding flowers many, many times. I did not focus on that in this presentation, so there's not really any bouquet pictures much, but I'm happy to answer any questions related to arranging during this, even though that's not really the focus of today. And then now, this is my world now. These are my two daughters. Rosalind is almost 5 and Meredith is 2. Here they were helping me plant dahlias, and they were very, very insistent on helping for about 5 tubers, and then ran off. The top right, there's my husband, and we were watering our peony patch. And then in the bottom right is David, who at Renfrow's, if you've been there, you all know him. He has become a flower lover by now. He was skeptical, I believe, at first, but he is now something that I know more than him about. It's about the only thing I know more than him about, but he's very much on board with flower gardening. And if I'm not at Renfrow's, since I'm not there much anymore, he will happily try to help you, point you in the right direction, and sometimes calls me when he's stumped. So I just was thinking about flowers in general when preparing this, and kind of nailed down 3 main reasons that I have for growing flowers, and what I assume many of you may have. And that would be beauty, which that is going to go unsaid. You'll see plenty of beautiful flowers. Pollination and beneficial insect attractants. And then a lot of flowers are edible, so I actually try to incorporate them in our food whenever I can, especially as wow factor when you go to a party. People love to see some edible blossoms in a salad. That is a beet salad with Sweet William right over there. That was just really fun to make. Anyways, wanted to start out with, for any of you who don't know flowers at all or are very new to this, it's pretty overwhelming to go to a garden center and look at all those seed packets lined up in rows and think, okay, I don't know how to grow that one. I don't know when that one is ready. I don't know what time of year, because all flowers have very different needs. I find that flowers are even a little bit harder to master than vegetables, because around here we mostly grow a couple dozen different types of vegetables, but there are several hundred flowers. So I'm going to go through a few categories of these flowers to help maybe give you a little bit more knowledge of when you're sitting in front of that bulb display of, okay, this is fall, this is the time of year to plant this. Here's, just basics of what the options are. I won't go into super detailed planting instructions for any of these things. I have some of that in your handout, but each flower is so different and has such different needs. I'm just going to paint broad strokes in this, but would love to answer any more specific questions. The first category would be annual flowers. Most of the time available to grow from seed. That would be the most economical option. Annuals either grow in the summertime, like the sunflowers and zinnias over here, which can be blooming right now. I have a few in the bouquets up here today. Or there are some like these bachelor buttons. You don't want to plant them for summertime. You plant them in the fall. They're little plants all winter, and then they bloom in the spring. So those are the two categories. The warm season annuals, this is, if you're very new to flowers, this would be the easiest category to start with, because it's when you plant tomatoes, when you plant your herbs. Mid-April to mid-May is the starting point for these is zinnias. This is coxcomb celosia. That's a really nice flower for drying. You can hang them upside down and dry them in a cool, dark spot, and they retain their color pretty well, and they're just a fun flower. And then here's marigolds, and there's a little spider in the picture. But warm season annuals, they would be most often planted direct seeds or little transplants you can start in March and then out into the garden. They'll bloom all summer, usually get pretty tired by the fall. They work really hard to just keep producing and keep producing flowers. So I find that these often do come down with diseases or just get really tired looking. But the thing is, those seeds were cheap. They put a lot of output for you. When it gets to October and they've got powdery mildew, I just pull them up and move on to something else. We'll talk about diseases and such, but these are just really good showstopper ones to build your confidence with. This is how I got started, was with, these and cosmos and sunflowers, those 5. Okay, then the cool season annuals are a whole different category of annual seeds that can be planted in the fall or the winter. And then they bloom most often in April, May, early June. They're really gorgeous. They were a lot of flowers I was not at all familiar with before getting into growing them. This is Buplorum, Love in a Mist, and then Feverfew. Feverfew kind of can live a couple of years, but is the most abundant that first blooming season. They are just a really fun option and can bring a lot of color to your fields after the fall, after the spring blooming bulbs like the tulips and daffodils and anemones are over, and usually right around or right after your peonies, but before you have any time for your summer annuals or your perennial crops to be blooming. These just fill a unique gap that if you have grown flowers for a while, sometimes you hit May and Mother's Day and you're like, well, why does my field not have much going on? These flowers fill that gap. This is larkspur, agrostemma, and this is false Queen Anne's lace. This is not the same as you see on the side of the road, but it's a cousin of some sort, actually much prettier and much more, much better for cut flowers. Does have a great base life, doesn't wilt as easily as the wild one does. But anyways, another category would be biennials, which are oftentimes grown on that same trajectory of you plant them in the fall, and then they are little plants all winter. You can protect them if you want to, or you can do like I always did and just left them to the elements. If it was going to be 6 degrees, I would get a row cover out and cover them for those 2 days, but largely left them alone. If you are good at babying and pampering plants, they will benefit from a little bit of winter protection with stronger plants and bigger stems. But if you don't have that time or are not that not interested in investing that much more money in things like row covers, you can still be really successful. So this is foxglove, black-eyed Susan, rudbeckia. There's a few different varieties and names of that. And then this would be a dianthus, which is sweet William. That's one of my favorite edible flowers. One note about foxglove, that is one of the most poisonous flowers. So I actually don't grow that one anymore. Once I had children, I stopped until I am past young children who put things in their mouth phase. So this is a gorgeous flower. I love it. But if you have pets or young children, I would just recommend waiting. Waiting on that one, or just knowing the flower. It's just, there are certain ones that are not worth that risk. Larkspur is a cousin of delphinium, and then those two are also poisonous to consume. So I have started growing larkspur again, but I have not grown foxglove lately. But anyways, speaking of those three categories, or those three slides, the cool season annuals and those biennials, this book is the only book I'm going to shout out with its own slide. It's a really great book by a really great flower farmer up in Newport News, Virginia. So very similar growing zone to us. She's a little bit cooler and probably a little more beachy being in that region. But it's a small book. It's not super long, but it gives all the information in a very straightforward manner of what you would need to know to delve into that type of flower, the cool flowers. And I know the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library does have this book as well. I've had friends tell me they've checked it out before. So just wanted to highlight that if you're interested in more depth about those cool flowers. Then there's perennials is the last big category, well, not the last one, but of plants. The herbaceous perennials would be everybody's favorite peonies, and then here's yarrow, or I say yarrow, but I think it's supposed to be yarrow. Just as two examples there, they bloom for a much shorter window of time each year than an annual does. They live in the same spot in the garden for many years. I mean, I have now about 1,000 peonies planted, and there's nothing else I can grow right there besides weeds. I don't try mixing in any other flowers with them. So there are pros and cons to everything, but they're a spectacular flower, but they only bloom for about 10 days of the year, each variety. So you have to weigh the pros and cons in your garden space of, do you want to make space for something like that? My vote would be yes, but I'm a little biased towards those flowers. So those are herbaceous peonies. They die back, or herbaceous perennials. They die back to the ground or almost completely to the ground in the winter, either completely hidden or just little small plants. The other type of perennial would be a woody perennial like this viburnum, which is a snowball bush is another name for it. It looks sort of like a hydrangea, but it blooms earlier in the spring, or in the middle of the spring, and it's a woody bush. It's never dies back to the ground, and it takes up space in your general landscape. Camellias would be another good example, or ruscus, of those things. All of these sort of things can all be cut flowers. Camellias don't last very long as a bloom. They're not going to be something that I would sell in an arrangement as a florist, but they're excellent in the home landscape, and you can have a lot of beautiful flowers of camellias in November or February when almost nothing else is blooming. Those woody perennials oftentimes are foliages, but here's just other foliage examples. This is Lenten Rose helleborus. It is a shade-loving flower. If you are a gardener that only has shade, you may have figured out by now that most vegetables don't like to grow in the shade, but you can actually grow quite a few flowers in the shade. There are certain ones that are really designed for that, and these grow in full deep shade with 20 deer, and deer do not touch them. So that's another really good bonus of the helleborus flower. Herbs, there's mint in two different kinds of mint in that photo, and then these would be grasses and grains. A lot of weeds can actually make really beautiful things in arrangements. Pokeweed, does anyone have pokeweed in their garden? That actually, I forgot to put my photo of pokeweed in there. When I was selling to florists, I had this one florist that wanted pokeweed every single week. And I'm making free money. My dad was so pleased. Free money on a weed that most people would almost give money to not have. I was able to at least make money off of it. But yeah, so in this foliage especially category, try anything you can find in your yard or in your next door neighbor's yard and see what its base life is like and if that can be incorporated into your garden, your cutting garden. These are hops. I don't know that I ever tried to see if they lasted very long in a bouquet, but I think without the leaves they would. And those are pomegranate flowers right here. I actually probably wouldn't put those in arrangement because I want to eat the actual pomegranate later, but I would if it was a really special reason. But anyway, so just want you to think more about that when you get home of what do you already have growing in your garden or in your landscape of whatever was there when you moved in. And you probably actually already have a good foundation of foliages for your future bouquet making endeavors. So a lot of those first crops, I mentioned the annuals could be grown from seed. Some of them are more ideally started from plant, either because they can't be propagated by seed like these heirloom chrysanthemums, or because the seeds take so long to grow and are so difficult for most seed starters, like a Lysianthus. I would order Lysianthus plugs. They'd come and be just these tiny little plants, and I would put them out in my netting, and they would already be about 4 months old right at this point and only be that big. So there are plants that you can buy in your budgeting for your flower gardens. One thing I just often recommend to people to think about is a seed packet is a lot cheaper, but in some cases, if you spend $5 on seeds, but you have to water that flat every day for 4 months before it's big enough to put in the garden, it may be worth it to your sanity to, if you want to grow something like Lysianthus, to look for the plant. And I have heard that those are available sometimes at big box stores. I've only ever ordered the little plugs through flower farming sources, but I do sell those kinds of plugs sometimes at the hardware store in little pots of 3. Get them in, pot them up, but I haven't done Lysianthus. That's the kind of thing I need feedback on what people are wanting us to sell at the store. So you people here listening, if you ever are looking for a certain flower crop, ask me because I can source just about anything if I have enough people interested in it. So those are a lot of things. The next section is, well, actually we'll take a break here for questions before we get into these bulbs and tuber sort of category.
A year ago.
Mhm.
So this is their second season in the ground. They still have bloom. So what do you recommend?
So she just asked that she bought some peony bare roots 2 seasons ago. So this was their second spring in the ground and they still haven't bloomed. I have a lot of them that are like that. So I would say that you've done nothing wrong. It's typically the 3rd year before you really expect blooms. Sometimes certain varieties or certain tubers that have a lot more of the little pink eyes on them might give you a bloom sooner. But most of the time, in my experience, it's been the 3rd year when they really start blooming a lot. Sometimes when a peony isn't blooming and it's older than that even, you might have planted it too deep. If they are planted more than about 1 inch or so around here, it's like they're too warm in the winter when they're that deep in the ground that they don't have enough of their cold chilling hours. And so they just don't bloom. That and then being in too shady of a spot and just not making blooms for many years because they're just not getting enough sun. Those are the 2 most common reasons, but I think in your case, it is probably that you just have to be patient. So what is the best viburnum to grow around here? That is a good question, and I am not afraid to tell you when I don't have a good answer. I have that viburnum bush, and that's the only one that I've ever grown, and it was already established when the farm was put into place, so I don't really know what to recommend. If anyone in here has grown one and wants to chip in on that, let me know. No, not you. Okay. those are the really big snowball ones. I've seen a lot of people in this area when I'm just walking in neighborhoods that have the ones that are more of a softball size, a little bit smaller, and just tons of them. But I don't know what that variety would be. Okay, Debbie, who is the host tonight, she said that she grows a lot of native viburnums in this area that are really good for the pollinators and look beautiful in the garden. They don't have a showy of blooms, but they are really sweet.
May we have another?
Enough.
Roses, how do you protect Japanese beetles from natural pests around the how to grow healthy ones? And we did have a presentation a couple of months ago, so I will send him to that about roses. But especially the Japanese beetle thing, but I don't think we talked about it.
Okay, this question from an online person was about roses and asking, how do you protect them from Japanese beetles? And then how do you just take care of grow a really good rose? Japanese beetles are a pain. We're kind of right at the end of that season, at least as I've seen at the farm. Our actual practice at our farm with Japanese beetles is to just ignore them. Typically, they wreak havoc for a couple of weeks and then they disappear. I know a lot of people that probably what I would do if I was still active out in the fields and trying to grow something like roses that I wanted really protected, I would take a bucket of soapy water and manually drop as many of them in there as I could. I pretty much discourage from spraying for things like Japanese beetles unless absolutely necessary. And the traps typically we hear don't work very well. The best thing to do is put the trap in your neighbor's yard and maybe they'll leave your yard for the trap and be there instead. But a lot of just learning how to coexist with some of those bad bugs is what we do. And yeah, I will go into that a little bit more. I was planning to talk about Japanese beetles for a minute, expecting that question later when I talk about pests, but that is kind of our go-to of try to just coexist. Are there any more questions? I know, yes? Oh, the netting. So that was, I think, let's see, on that slide right here, this netting is called Hort Nova netting. It is really good if you're growing large amounts of flowers that are typically topple over in the wind. So these Lysianthus get these long, I mean, they don't get super tall, but they, for florists, really want the straight stems, not the flopped over by the storm stems. And so I use it as a planting grid on the ground to start with. And that helps me space things without having to look at a ruler. But then we put it up several inches as the plants grow on some T-posts for some wind protection. So I don't know if I'll end up having another photo of that in the presentation, but in the recent years, I've mostly used it as my way to plant things really quickly as my spacing guide. Any more before our next section? Okay, let's talk about bulbs. There's a lot of different kinds of bulbs and other tubers and such. Here are two of my favorites. These are tulips. Flower farming with tulips versus flower gardening with tulips are very different things. Flower farmers treat them as an annual. We plant them like this, all really close together, and then so they're about a foot deep. This was in the early years. On this previous slide, you'll see we got smart and I've started planting them on the ground putting a raised bed on top and then filling bags of soil on top of that. That's a lot less work than digging 12 inches deep for all those yards, which we did several times before I had that good idea. But anyways, so for a flower farming, you plant them in these really tight egg carton type ways, and then 12 inches of soil on top. so that when they're blooming, you can pull the whole bulb out of the ground, and that gives you about an extra foot of stem length. So I wouldn't say that that would be how you would plant them in your own garden. Tulips are also a challenge in that around here they mostly bloom that one year beautifully, and then they don't bloom again for several years. It takes several years of growth for the bulbs to reproduce, to store up enough energy to bloom again. So while I love tulips, I have a lot of customers at the hardware store that have decided it's not worth growing them, and they come and buy a bouquet of or two of them from me in the spring, and that scratches their itch without them having to keep investing in the tulip bulbs that don't return for very long. Another flower bulb is tuberose. That's one that would be blooming about right now. I kind of had forgotten about my patch. I think they're covered in weeds right now. Finding these photos made me think I need to go look at them and see if they're getting close to blooming. It's usually July, August. That's just a really fragrant summertime bulb. Let's see. Some other bulb options would be, this is a St. Joseph lily. It was given to me by a Union County gardener that really loves them, and we've started growing them at the farm in hopes of someday having enough stock to sell that bulb at the store. It blooms probably late May, early June. I can't remember exactly. It's already happened this year. Up here are Dutch irises. That's a fall planted bulb, and then lilies. I have only a few of those left from back when I grew a bunch of lilies that have stayed and just come back each year, and each year they get bigger and bigger. So one of this type of lily bulb in our raised bed had at least 30 blooms on the one stalk this year. If you leave lilies in place, they just can get bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's not practical for cutting at all anymore. No arrangement would fit 30 blooms, but it's really cool looking in the garden. Oh, here's another picture of the raised beds that we grow tulips in. This picture is actually from March 2020, that week that the world shut down, and that's exactly when my tulips were blooming, and I didn't know what to do with them when we were told to stay at home. So they actually all kind of blew open. When you're harvesting tulips to sell, you don't let them get to this point. But that week we had no idea whether I'd even have a market for them. So I just got to enjoy sitting beside them on the and looking at them and letting my daughter pick as many of them as she wanted. But I just added that picture in for that memory. But I already went through the thing about the flower farming. If you are growing them, deer do love tulips. That's another issue that people have, or I have on some of the flower farming Facebook groups that I've been in. People will have their farm, and then the blooms it's about time to harvest, and their goats get out of their fence and eat all of them. So tulips are a love-hate for a lot of people. Another type of bulb type thing is technically called a corm. These are anemone corms, and these are them after they've pre-sprouted, which is what I like to do before planting them. These are a fall crop. We'll look at the flowers of what they turn into in the next slide. I wrote an article for a online education platform many years ago about growing that specific flower. If you're at all interested in anemones, which look like this, I could send you that link. Are they getting this PowerPoint sent to them? Yeah, if people are interested, I have a lot of links that you don't want to write that down. But yes, you can share it afterwards if people are interested. And then ranunculus are up here. They washed out after being planted in some sort of rainstorm. But ranunculus look like this. They're sort of confused for roses a lot of times for people. I have not a lot of experience growing roses myself, but I have enjoyed growing ranunculus, and those bloom in about March to April, and the anemones bloom in February, March, and they're really vivid colors and look really nice at that time of year when you're ready for some color. So that would be a corm, as an example of a corm, if you see that anywhere. An example of a tuber would be a dahlia. Peonies and daylilies are two other tuber examples. I also have a chart in your handout that gives just a few examples of each of these types of flowers. Dahlias are really beautiful. They're known to be pretty difficult to grow around here, at least on a farming scale. In a backyard garden where you're a little more attentive, it may be easier, but they're worth the effort, and they are perennials. So you buy your tuber once, and if you dig it up in the fall, you can divide it into 5 or 6 a lot of times and be multiplying your crop really well, or you can leave them in the ground. This is what a dahlia tuber looks like, and you're looking for these little eyes. So if you're buying dahlias at a store and can see into the packaging, you want to see those, and you want to see them looking plump and not all dried out. It does not matter as much if it has a lot of the roots on there. The more important is its potential for growth. So I have had plenty that maybe just are this one piece with 2 or 3 little eyes that grow very well. So it's not necessarily you looking for the biggest tuber in the box, but just the one that looks healthy. We plant them out in long rows. I kind of do a double row, and I think I do about 2 feet apart, and then about 18 inches between them, all the way down. They are a little bit finicky for me. This spot right here, I planted them in a really low part of the field because they do like a lot of water, but they don't like too much water. And as you'll see later on, what happens with too much water. So moving on to rhizomes, that would be, it's like a swollen stem that's just planted very shallowly, bearded iris, and then calla lilies. Not a great picture of calla lily, but couldn't find a better one from our field. All of these pictures, except that one of the book, are all from our farm. So these are all pictures that I've taken over the past decade. It's been pretty fun for me going through all of these and all the memories that have resurfaced. I'd forgotten I'd grown some of these things. So before we get to the next section, I'll just circle back to talking about how I thought of nourishment as a reason for growing flowers. This is crimson clover. It's actually a cover crop that is really good at adding nitrogen back into your soil. I don't know that these last super long in a bouquet, and they're not huge, but they're a beautiful color in April, and you can actually dry them and make tea. You can also probably use the leaves in arrangements. We this year found that our rabbits, we're raising meat rabbits, the rabbits loved the clover. That was their favorite of all the different forages we would harvest at the farm and bring home to them. So we really enjoy that crop. So really this was nourishing us through the rabbits. And 2 of the fun edibles that are wintertime are pansies and violas. Those look really beautiful in salads or on cakes or whatnot. And right here, I was driving here and thinking about this and realized I missed one more category of that. Something that people love to see in flower bouquets, if you're giving them to people, is an edible item in the bouquet. I was florist / bridesmaid, I think 5 times, florist / wedding guest, at least that many times or more. So I've gotten a lot of wedding flower feedback at the events that I've been to, and almost every time what people love to see is, oh look, there's a cherry tomato in that arrangement, or there's some cowpeas, or all the different herbs, especially when it's an herb they recognize like mint. That's what people talk about. So if you're really wanting your wow factor for growing things that you're already growing like mint, think about using those in your bouquets, because I mean, every time that's what people are really interested in. So you can use food in your arrangements. And then just quickly talking about, benefiting nature and native plants. Our whole reason for getting started in flowers at our farm was for these bees, to get some, and then for when we, right after that, creating that flower garden, we had a beekeeper start off with 10 or 12 hives, and he's worked up to close to 100 on our farm at times. Now we're down to about 40. That John Caudle of Herb's Honey, if y'all are familiar with him, he has just hundreds of hives all over the county. But we love to have a lot of flowers that the bees can enjoy. Even when flower farming in a large scale, I would always intentionally grow a whole lot more zinnias and things than I ever needed so that the bees could enjoy them. Because in flower farming, you're really wanting to harvest your blooms pretty much right as they're ripe and ready. So the bees are not even really getting to enjoy most of those. But I always tried to make sure that we had plenty, and that's just beautiful. So that just goes through, oh, and this actually, here's one more, the native plant. Has anyone grown mountain mint before? Okay, I love mountain mint. I should have thought to add in a video here of when I took this picture. We have a 5x5 raised bed patch. It is a cousin to regular mint, so it creeps. You don't want it to be in your main garden area. But that 5x5 patch had, I mean, it had to have been 200 bees of all different kinds and wasps on these little flowers in about July. It's really at around this time of year. Just going to town. So if you could add one native plant in your garden that would be good for pollinators, that would be, in my experience, one that's very worth being near the top of your list. Quickly before moving to the next section, I know that was just a lot of different flowers that you saw and a lot of different ideas. Can be overwhelming. So I just picked 5 of my favorites of these 5 different categories, just to give you a little bit of a summary for when you get home and you want to start thinking about what you might want to add to your garden. Easy, edible, pollinators, poisonous, which may mean you don't want to grow them, or you just need to be informed if you do want to. They're wonderful. And then perennials and biennials. So that is in your handout. You don't have to write it down, but I just wanted to pop it up there. Now I want to do a question break before we move to the next section. Yes.
How did you keep rabbits off of your down?
We actually have never had a rabbit problem at our farm. We have rats, we have rodents, we've got squirrels, but I have not had rabbits. Does anyone in here, oh, and I forgot to mention that question, how do you keep rabbits off your dahlias? Does anyone in here have experience that they would want to share? There are some products that you can spray, some organic, like scent deterrents. I haven't ever used them to know if that would really work. Usually a physical barrier is the best thing for a rabbit. Any other questions? Yes. Question about the poisonous flowers, that's a good question. Is it poisonous only if you eat it, or is it also poisonous if you get it on your hands? Some of both. This euphorbia snow on the mountain, I would assume it's also poisonous if you eat it, but what I was thinking of and had experience with is that you cut it and it has a sap, sort of like a milkweed plant, and that sap can give people a really bad burn, or if you get it in your eyes or something, it can be really bad. I quit growing it because I decided it wasn't worth the risk. I tried it for a while and then decided not to even put it in people's bouquets anymore because some people are very sensitive to that. So that specific one is more of the sap. I think with the other 3, oh, and then milkweed is probably that same sap related one. The other 3 I think is just internally consuming. I've harvested those many times and never seen any sort of skin irritant for me. But there are others like the false Queen Anne's lace. Certain people are allergic to that and will get dermatitis if it gets on their skin. So a lot of that you'll experience and really grow into some of those allergies the more you've been exposed to them. I started reacting to some of those kinds of things the longer I was flower farming. Maybe didn't at the very beginning. I don't really know why, but usually the internet can tell you if there's typical skin irritation. Right? Yes. Mm.
I noticed I was really sunflowers. This pollen was all over them. Growing more pollen.
Mm-hmm.
This was vases. They grow, but I did it in vases
Okay, so this question for those online was that this lady is a bee farmer and has grown lots of flowers and has noticed a lot of pollen on sunflowers, especially when she brings them in and gets pollen all over her counter. So she switched to the pollenless variety of sunflowers, which I have a few pictures of in the slideshow. Anything that's pro-cut is a pollenless strain. Johnny's Seeds also has a lot of pollenless different pollenless sunflowers. And actually, I have one over here I noticed we picked. It was just a volunteer. Even when you're growing a pollenless sunflower and it comes back up the next year, pollen can be back because they're a hybrid. That one was just a volunteer. But I haven't seen too many of my other flowers that do that. Some do, and some that are not as, I guess, in my experience, ones that do shatter and have just a lot of mess are ones that I didn't grow for selling to florists. And you'll probably just find in your experience that some are better enjoyed in the garden versus inside. But I mean, I do have some that get that way at home, and I just make sure they're on a counter where they're not going to mess anything up. So I don't really have a recommendation. Possibly if you're harvesting them a little earlier, like before they've matured as much, there might be less pollen on the flowers. But sorry, I don't have a much more solid answer for that question, but it's a great observation. I have seen that in my flowers too. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned differences in technique for a lot of these flowers. I think the one that you mentioned was tulips.
Mm-hmm.
The difference in technique between the home setting and the farm setting.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you have a lot of farm experience. So for those of us without the farm experience, are there any resources that we can use to understand, hey, for this certain flower, this is what you need to do if you're doing it in a farm setting or you're doing a lot?
So as a homeowner, you're interested in the farm or in the home? Are you interested in learning more of the farming side? Okay, at the end, I do have a few books and stuff at the end of the presentation, and then I can get you some more resources too. But at the end, I have a few of my favorite books, including the one that I already mentioned, and those were the ones I got started with on flower farming. Because I personally find that you can probably read a flower farming book and back it up into gardening more easily than reading a flower gardening book and scale it forward into farming. I think with the farming books, you're going to have a little bit more technical information a lot of times that then you can cut down the number of plants you grow or not grow them in those same kinds of rows and just plant them just more around your landscape. I think you can translate it. So that's why I'm going to recommend some farming related books because I think they're valuable even if you're just growing a backyard garden. Okay, any other questions before we move on? Okay, so this is a little bit more about planting and growing these specific blooms. As I've said several times, a lot of, each flower is going to have such different needs and different recommendations. So these are going to be sort of big picture ideas, but they will hopefully be helpful for you. Here's just a few pictures of some seed starting supplies, seeds, and good compost soil. Those are three of the sort of the beginning. So for seed starting, if you are wanting to grow anything from seed in not just directly into the ground, but in little pots in your house under a grow light beforehand to extend your season or get things blooming sooner, the main things that they need are soil, good soil, heat to get them germinated, and moisture. You don't even need a light at the very beginning. So seed starting can be an expensive setup endeavor. If you're not really sure if you want to get into it or not, we recommend some sort of cheap ways at the hardware store. And one of those would be if you don't have a heat mat, because those do only have one purpose, it's to heat trays. You can use the top of your refrigerator and put your flats up there, and that usually has enough heat, or on a heat register earlier in the winter when you're running your heat. And once the seeds pop up out of the soil, they don't really need that heat as much anymore as they do light. So you can take it down from your refrigerator and put it under a really high intensity fluorescent light, or outside if it's at a different time of year, to get the eye hurting strength of light that they need. A lot of times in our experience, when people come in having started seeds and are having some struggles, the biggest struggle is usually having leggy plants. And that just means they're reaching, searching for more light. So this seed starting can be a whole class. We've done that class at Renfrow's many times over the years. It's pretty in-depth, but that is some of the just very high level. Seed packets are going to tell you on there when you want to start them, and they will say things like start indoors 6 weeks before your final frost. So because everyone's going to buy these in different places, and you don't know when, they don't know when your final frost will be, you have to know that. In our area, does anybody know roughly when the last frost is in the spring? Tax day, yes. We like to do it by holidays, tax day. So, okay, those who know that, what about when's the first frost in the fall? Halloween, yes, Halloween. So what you will want to do when you're buying your seed packets and looking at that, you'll have to do that math yourself of, okay, I need to count backwards from tax day, or count backwards from Halloween for the direct seeding, cool annual flowers. And have some good soil lined up. You don't even have to have fancy seed trays. You can cut holes in the bottom of your yogurt cups. Like it does not have to be anything super elaborate. If I was saying the things you would need to spend money on, of those, good quality seeds and a good quality seed starting soil would be the two top of my list. I have seen plenty of friends that have just pulled dirt out of their garden, like clay or something, and tried to start seeds indoors with it, and it just rarely goes well. But having a potting soil also is usually sterile, so they're not bringing in a lot of the diseases that you may have in your soil that big plants are going to fight just fine, but little tender seedlings may struggle with. So good seeds, good soil, and then your heat and moisture you can do, and then the light. So pretty much any of these seeds can be started by you. It's just going to be a skill level. It's a lot easier to grow a zinnia seed than a snapdragon seed, and that you may just have trial and error. I'm happy to help give you recommendations on which ones to try first if you're new into flower gardening. So if you're sowing seeds, this actually top bullet applies for either outdoors or in your seed trays. No matter the size of the seed, you sort of plant it twice that diameter's depth. So those teeny weeny snapdragon seeds practically are just on top of the soil, but a zinnia seed that's a lot bigger needs to be pushed down a little more. You want to provide ample space between each plant in the garden, even if that means you have sown your seeds too thick. This actually right here were some self-seeded, I believe, forget-me-nots. Those just came up on their own, but if you see that, you want to then thin those out. You're not going to be able to have that many big plants all in one spot. But a lot of times with little seeds, it's easier to sow them thickly and be disciplined to go back and thin them. You can either dig them up if they're a little bit bigger, or trim them with scissors, or just use your hoe. And each flower is going to be a different size. So I can't give you right here you need to have them 4 inches apart or 14 inches apart number, but all of the seed packets typically will even have that information on there of the proper spacing. More is always better in a garden. If you're not in a farm situation trying to maximize your space for money. At the hardware store with vegetable customers, we are constantly telling people to plant fewer and put them further apart, because good airflow is the best preventer of disease. And so with anything, if you've got more plants crammed together, you may think you're going to end up with more flowers or more tomatoes, but when those get diseased halfway through the season and actually in their life earlier than they would have from being too close together, then you didn't end up with as many as you thought. And then when flower seedlings are young, keep them weeded as best you can and label them, because flower seedlings look like weed seedlings so often. It's very hard to remember when you're learning new flowers what they all look like. I still struggle with that sometimes. So just little labels like that, or any method for labeling it, making a map on your phone, just whatever you need to do. Don't expect to remember where they all are. And then, so for transplanting young plants, I didn't quite finish all my thoughts here, but you set them out. When you're buying them at a greenhouse or nursery, they're going to most of the time be ready to go in the garden. Plant them, I usually to pull them out of the pot, kind of massage the roots a little bit to loosen them a bit. Make sure that the plant is very well watered before you plant it, but then also water it in nicely. And most of the time I try to cover all of the potting soil that is the pot that the plant comes in with your garden soil so that it dries out less quickly. But with that, I mean, that's just like any sort of growing any sort of herb or vegetable as well, same sort of method. Fertilizer. So I brought a few bags of fertilizer here from the hardware store. Plant tone, flower tone, bulb tone, just as examples to show you if you haven't ever thought about fertilizing flowers before. We mostly use plant tone at the farm just because they are pretty similar. It's a lot easier for us to just have one type and to use the big bags. So most of the time, don't get hung up in needing every single specific product for your flowers. If you are already growing vegetables or herbs and already have plant tone, use that. Don't worry about getting flower tone or something like it. By all means you can, but I want you to be successful and not spend too much money to get started so that you enjoy your hobby and don't feel like it's a money sink. So that is what I most often recommend. Compost, I would say if you want a good compost, we love this one called Stout Ollie, and I sometimes will fill up a whole raised bed with that, and it grows things so well. But you can grow your own, have your own compost pile. When you're composting your own things, you just need to take good care that it's fully rotted down. It takes a long time unless you're actively really working on it. We do the passive composting method at the farm. And I think that's on the next slide. Let's see. Okay, yes. So passively composting, I'll mention in a second. And the last thing I'll mention here, especially because we're at extension services, if you get your soil tested, that helps. For starting any garden or any new garden area, getting your soil tested, which the extension service does, you mail it off to Raleigh. Only costs about $4 in shipping at their busy time of year. The rest of the year, it's only shipping costs. That will help you figure out, oh, I'm really deficient in my soil with such and such nutrient. If you're just growing things and just keep having these issues that you can't quite figure out, having that baseline of knowing what's in your soil will be helpful. And there's lots of people here and at a lot of garden centers that can help you interpret those results. But back to compost, we love mulching our plants. These are tomatoes here, but the principle is the same. Composted leaves is what we love to use. This is Ruth, my aunt, my dad David's sister. She does a lot of farm work. And then Gaspar, he's worked at Renfrow's and at the farm since I was a baby, or maybe before I was around. They are mulching our tomatoes many years back, but we like to get big truckloads of landscaper leaves, but you in your neighborhood probably have all these nice neighbors who bag up all their leaves and put them by the side of the road waiting for the city to come pick them up. You should just go pick them up and put them in a big old pile in your backyard. And these here look like they're probably 2 years old or so. By the year 3, it looks just like black dust dirt. When they're just 1 year old or less, they look more like leaves because that's what they are. But we use, in the summertime, we try to use mulch around a lot of our plants, like these tomatoes. I would use them around zinnias or cosmos or anything to keep the weeds down. So you wait until your flowers are just tall enough that when you start spreading your leaves, you're not going to knock them or break their stems. So you have to weed by hand for a little while before using something like leaf mulch, but then it saves so much work. And it just benefits your soil. Mother Nature does not like bare ground. So this covers it with a blanket and keeps the weeds from coming up, and it just satisfies it more. We typically like to wait until, I think it was mid to late June, maybe middle of June, before we would set out our mulch around tomatoes. Tomatoes like it really warm. So if you put mulch down in April, right after you plant something like a tomato or a zinnia, you're going to be not letting the soil heat up to their ideal preferred temperature enough. But that wouldn't matter as much for, say, a tulip in the fall. You can plant those down and cover them fully with the leaves, and they will come up through that. A bulb can have a mulch layer pretty much straight over top of it. Peonies really don't like a lot of leaf mulch. I try to keep those pretty clean. They really don't want to be buried very deep, and mulch can make them seem deeper. But other than peonies, I really can't think of any of the fall flowers that wouldn't benefit from you covering them with your leaves, even if those are the ones straight from your neighbor's yard, straight on top of your buried tulips or daffodils, because they'll be strong enough to push through them when they're ready to emerge. So if anyone has not thought of using leaves, that is our favorite, because people don't spray their trees with pesticides. So they're about as clean as you can get. There may be a little bit of trash, but trash is easy to pick up. But like yard clippings and other people's food waste, you don't know what kind of chemicals, especially in yard clippings, that could be there. So this is just what we do. Same with animal manure. If you can find a good animal manure source that definitely didn't eat any hay with chemicals, use that. But if you can't be guaranteed that those animals didn't eat well, a lot of those can live through the digestive tract and can really mess up your garden later on. So talk about watering for a minute. Overwatering is typically people's most common error in killing their own plants. In all of our years of retail experience, it's very easy to overcare for your plants. They need a lot of oxygen in the soil, and if you're watering every single day, you'll essentially be drowning your plants in the long run. So in our heat of summer, I aim for just 1 inch of water per week, whether that was an inch from a thunderstorm or several hours of a sprinkler running, or however your irrigation may be set up. That'll just be trial and error. But what I like to look at, the plants will tell you if they need water. These black-eyed Susans in the summer pretty much always look like this in the heat of the day. They just wilt. Squash plants just absolutely wilt. That's their way of conserving water. If you look at them again after dinner time, this was maybe taken at noon. If you look at them at 8 o'clock at night or at 8 a.m. the next morning and they're perky, that was not them actually begging you to be watered. So a lot of times, you can also just feel in the ground, and if you feel it totally bone dry, then yes, water them. But don't always assume immediately that means you need to get your hose out right away. Sometimes it will be, but a lot of times, especially with like these summer flowers or squash or something, they can just be kind of fooling you. And you can end up doing more damage than good by thinking you need to water them every afternoon. I tend to prefer watering in the morning or the evening, not in the heat of the day, so that you're not losing a lot of it to evaporation before it sinks into the ground. And as with vegetable gardening, we recommend you trying to just water the soil, not trying to hit all of the plant as best as you can, because the soil has pathogens in it that can bounce up onto the leaves if you're just watering everything indiscriminately, or just anything that just stays wet is just going to get funky. Y'all had that rain for a whole week straight, and I'm sure everybody's garden started looking kind of puny or getting diseases after a whole week with no sunshine. So to practice good watering would be to mostly aim for hitting towards the roots, and the foliage does not need to be wet. Let's see. One comment about the watering, though, is that anything that's in pots or a raised bed are going to need more frequent watering than anything you have planted in the ground. We have lots of raised beds at the farm, though, and I pretty much water them maybe during 2 weeks of the hottest part of the summer. Otherwise, I let them be on their own, and it's just encouraging deeper roots. Our raised beds are also full of a lot of perennials like the mountain mint or Jerusalem artichokes and things that are there long term, so they don't really need water. They might do a little better with more than they have, but everybody only has so much time on their hands. So if you are and you're looking at your garden and thinking of how do I prioritize what I have time for, feeling in your raised beds or in your pots to feel if you feel any moisture, those often will need it first. So before we move to pests and disease, ready for questions? Anybody?
We can have one question.
Okay.
One of our Could you just spread that around? We have
Mature, yes. Okay, so question was about chicken manure and wood shavings, pine shavings or whatnot in their chicken coop. You will need to let those, move that out to compost for a while. I don't remember how long chickens take. I think it's probably a year or more. I don't remember exactly though. Yes, you can eventually use chicken manure, but you want to really be sure that you're not going to burn your plants. And if you ever are going to start experimenting with animal manures like that and wondering if they're ready or not, probably two of the easiest things to do would be to either get a pack of lettuce seeds or a pack of tomato seeds. Those would be considered the two canaries in the mine of garden vegetables. If you sow some seeds in that compost and they come up looking stunted or looking anything unusual, that means that it is not ready yet. Tomatoes will look funky or lettuce will look not right if the compost is not mature enough. So that would be that, or take a little bit of it and try it on one plant in one corner of your garden. Do not just go spread it on everything immediately. You want to test it, watch it for several days to a week before you then dive in using it. Okay, any other questions? All right, we'll go to, I don't even have a clue what time it is. Am I running 10 more minutes? Okay, I'll make sure to get through it all. Pests and disease. Ultimately, my main go-to for recommending on diseases and pests will be to talk to your extension agents and to your master gardeners and to the guys at Renfrow's if you want, or any of your garden centers. They can help you identify stuff. The extension websites have a lot of really great YouTubes and articles though about, okay, let's see if I bring in my zinnia leaf and look at all these pages, I can probably figure out what my problem is. But for me, in what I tend to recommend to people is stuff like a zinnia is going to probably get powdery mildew by the end of the season. In October it's just tired and the conditions are not hot and dry anymore. Usually we're hitting the hurricane remnants season, and diseases will just come up, but you have to look at your plant and think of, okay, how much longer is this plant going to live? If it's only at a maximum going to be 4 more weeks until it dies of frost, is it worth spraying it with any sort of fungicide? If it's a peony and it is March and you're wanting to have beautiful peony blooms in May and you know that that's a long-lived plant, your risk assessment may be, give you a different result. But by and large, I find annual flowers, I just don't sweat it. I pull them up if they don't look good. But if a perennial like a gardenia or something is having a problem, that's when I would get some help on diagnosing it, and then either get the most organic of the chemicals that you can do, or try, even before that, the good clean housekeeping of cutting off any diseased looking leaf and just seeing if you can help the plant get a little bit of a head start to grow out of that before resorting to chemicals. I mean, any sort of chemical, organic or synthetic, is going to be disrupting the animal life or the fungus life in your garden. And just like with human medicine, most oftentimes it's best to try to avoid medicine as if you can, and figure out how to get the plant healthy otherwise. And a lot of times just good gardening practices will help with that, but not always. Pests, the aphid is a big problem on a lot of flowers, like people's roses and things. If you don't know what a pest is, you can bring a little baggie of one into Renfrow's. We can help pull out our charts and help you figure it out. There are also a lot of really great resources on that the master gardeners and extension people have on pests, and the same stuff goes for your inputting into a very delicate ecosystem when you're trying to start killing certain insects versus others. And a lot of things don't, a lot of the chemicals are broader spectrum than targeting one specific thing. So you don't really want to upset the apple cart if you can instead pull out all the diseased leaves and throw them away. One thing we do like to do, though, is add beneficial insects like ladybugs or praying mantis into the garden. But anytime you do that, you definitely can't spray anything a week later, because then you're killing the bugs you just purchased. But those ladybugs eat quite a few of the small pests that people have issues with. And then there are lots of other kinds of bugs available on the internet and maybe at other stores. I'm just speaking of what I know, but there's just, ladybugs are a lot of fun. Okay, quickly into weather problems. This was my dahlia patch one year, and Hurricane Florence came and poured about 10 inches of rain in 1 week, and it totally killed them. This is what a drowning plant looks like. So sometimes this can be deceiving, and you see this in your garden and it hasn't been raining, but you've been watering and you're like, why is it still wilting? I'll give it some more water. I think it's still thirsty. That is a sign of drowning. So sometimes you have to really step back a minute when you see something like that in your garden and think, okay, is this plant wilting, or is it have too much water? In the same field, though, the cosmos and the upper part of the field looked excellent, and they had the prettiest cosmos I ever grew that same month after that hurricane. But yeah, too much rain is usually the hardest thing to deal with in a garden. It's a lot harder to deal with than not enough rain. You can always water, but you can't take rain away. So something like the week we had a couple weeks ago is usually farmers' worst nightmare. They'd rather deal with a drought. Cold can bite back things like jumping up bulbs like these Dutch iris, but it didn't kill them. Most bulbs are still going to be pretty tough and continue to grow even if they look rough for a little while. And then frost just happens at the end of the season every year, and you just have to know that, okay, my dahlia season is coming to an end. But there are ways to try to, get an extra week or two by covering. As I mentioned, drought. I would rather deal with a drought than too much rain. And that kind of speaks for itself there. I think since we don't have as much time yet left, I'll go into the flower harvesting and care tips. So in the summertime, I like to harvest flowers early in the morning before breakfast, or at kind of 7:30, 8 o'clock after the sun is no longer hitting a flower. But the rest of the year, that doesn't really matter, but things like zinnias just perk up a lot better if they are not harvested in the heat of the day. So timing is really only super critical at this time of year, or for very certain crops. You will learn just from trial and error of, okay, this bachelor button likes to be picked in the morning. It doesn't really look as good if it's picked at night. But really the most important things are right here. Using clean, sharp snips or shears. I have some examples of some up here if you don't own any and just want to see what they look like. And you harvest into a clean bucket of water, not some muddy thing or something that's not been washed. I think in the flower farming world, they pretty much tell you, you want to be able to be confident of drinking out of that bucket yourself before you would put flowers in it, which, I mean, you got to be really clean for that. And then removing all the leaves that would touch or be submerged in the water is the best way to keep the water clean. If you look at my two vases here, I tend to try really hard to keep that because then you don't have to change the water as often and it doesn't get murky. My two young daughters have picked up on that habit so well that anytime they go picking a flower at the farm, they're immediately talking about stripping the leaves and stripping them in the field because we try to strip all the leaves off, usually on the spot. Changing the water of your bouquets every few days is always beneficial, though you can be lazy because you didn't pay for that bouquet. You did spend a lot of time on it, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. But I usually recommend you're going to end up with a few extra days of vase life from it. And certain flowers, like these sunflowers, can make the water pretty yucky pretty fast. So sometimes you need to change water and trim stems even more often. Any flower stem that you look at that has sort of hairs on it, like a sunflower or a zinnia, those would be considered more of the dirty flowers. They just collect more gunk, I guess, and turn the water gross faster. Flower food, if you've got access to that, or you see those on the grocery store packets, you can use it. It does help. It keeps your water more clean, but to be more economical, just clean together is the most important. Let's see. Okay, the last point right here, the certain flowers don't mix well together in a vase. I don't find very many that have very many examples of that. The main one that I could think of is that certain daffodils, when you harvest them, if you've noticed, they just sap oozes out of them, and they're blooming at around the same time of year as tulips, and tulips do not do well mixed together with that necessarily. So a lot of times if I'm picking both and I do want them to be in the same bouquet, I will just have the daffodils in a separate bucket for a while and then move them once they're done oozing. I don't retrim the stems and then I move them into the tulip bouquet. Flowers all have varying lengths of vase life. Some things last 3 days, some 13, and everything in between. It's hard to say. I aimed for when I would do selling bouquets, I would aim to have a week. So anything that was not consistently giving a week of vase life, even not changing the water, like the lowest level of care, if it just couldn't make it that long, I quit growing it or quit selling it at least. And then every flower has a different ideal stage for harvesting. This is a very broad topic, so it's hard to give you super specifics. But for instance, zinnias, I brought a few here. You have to perform sort of what we call the wiggle test on a zinnia out in the field. If you've got it and you wiggle it and it's pretty stiff, the stem is stiff like this, it's ready. I tried to find one today but couldn't. Sometimes they'll be just totally floppy and soft. That means that stem is not mature enough to harvest. A lot of times people pick their zinnias when they look like they're open enough, but they're just not sturdy enough and they will not last as long. So that's just one example of something you'll just get to know your flowers as you grow them. And soon the wiggle test, like you almost won't have to do it. You'll be able to then see it and know what's going to work and what's going to be harvestable. But for a long time, the wiggle test on zinnias is really helpful. Also peonies, if you're wanting to pick a peony to come inside and have the maximum base life, you harvest it when the bud feels like a marshmallow, not when it's already fully open. And then you get the benefit of it opening for a day or two in your house and it not getting damaged by rain or bugs. So that would just be another example. I can pause right there for questions, and then I just have sort of 2 minutes of wrap up. Yes. Yes, hydrangeas, how do you keep them and keep them from shriveling and drying up? I think that happens to everybody. I struggle with hydrangeas too. I have not grown them at the farm. I think they're pretty dependent on certain timing of day for harvest. I think my Aunt Ruth, she grows a lot of them and was telling me something like, you have to pick them before the sun gets on them in the morning. Something like that is what she has found for her plants and her situation work. When I have bought them I have bought them to do in weddings a lot. People really love them in wedding flowers. And when they get all wilty, I have to almost submerge the whole thing to get it to revive. They're pretty finicky. They are a challenge. But yeah, just experimenting. If you have a hydrangea bush, experiment and harvest one at 4 different times a day and take notes. Yes.
If you put warm water in the.
Oh, okay, warm water. That is what Sarah says is helpful. Okay, next question.
Like tap water or like
Yes. For all the flowers, you mean? Or just anything? Okay, so question on what kind of water I use. I use whatever clean water that the city provides or that I have in a well. I think at the farm had to use the city water for washing vegetables and for doing the flowers in terms of, I guess, following whatever protocols they had. We had a well, but used that for watering in the fields, but kept to, I think, the city and what they had documented for the things. But I've done any of those things, whichever you want to do. I wouldn't stress about filtering your water before you putting in your flower vase. Okay, any other questions? Oh, yes, Amanda? It is always whatever one has just started blooming in the spring that I haven't seen in a whole year. Back before children, when I had a lot more time to be excited about flowers and not so busy, I would walk around the farm or the yard and just come back in with an armful of whatever it is that was just beginning and just gushing over it to my husband, and he'd just kind of sit there and he really likes tulips and dahlias. Those are his 2 blooms that he prefers over all others, that he could never get very excited about a fancy daffodil with me, but I always did. In terms of favorite, I think what's coming up to be my favorite are going to be these peonies. So you've seen all these pictures of what we've been doing and what I've grown for years. I've scaled way back because of these 2 little girls to where I'm not doing wedding flowers anymore. I'm not growing 50 different kinds of flowers in a year. But we have planted this whole field behind us here in over 1,000 peony plants. And then there's a couple hundred back on the other side of the farm there. And so my husband and daughters and I are looking into getting into larger scale peony production and into selling wholesale to florists and wholesalers, because I really enjoy that flower. People really enjoy that flower. I'd say that that's my one that gets people the most excited every year. And they're just they come in at a really good time of year for our family, and weather-wise, it's a whole lot easier to bring the girls to the farm 3 times a day when it's only in the 60s versus the 90s for harvesting. So we just have decided to get into peonies in a much larger way. We planted 600 or 700 of them this past fall. So I expect in 2025 or so, we'll begin harvesting those. We have several hundred mature plants right now from that picture. This was all just 1 week's of harvest. I probably had 3 truckfuls over the whole season, maybe 4, but this was our peak week right there. And sold all of those stems, and so excited to do more. Oh, and then this is probably the most popular flower I grow. This is called Coral Sunset. Coral Charm is about the same. Peony, it starts off this hot pink when you harvest it, then it fades 2 days later into this light coral, and then on the last day, it's this ivory yellow. So it goes through all the colors of a sunset in 1 week. It's a really spectacular flower. So I planted about 200 more. So yeah, so that is really what I see in the future for our farm with flowers, and then just growing a few here and there for fun for me in just the next several years. And then once I get out of this little kid phase of life, I may change my mind and get back into it. But for at least the foreseeable future, that's where we're headed. Oh, and then this, I do think if you can send them this spreadsheet, this PowerPoint, so that they can go through some of my favorite sources, because that's too much to write down right now. But I have, flower books. Those are actually mostly geared towards farming or very serious gardening level. So they're very good books. Those 3 names, Erin Benzacane. She's a floret flower, if anyone follows her on Instagram or anything. Lynn Bazinski and Lisa Ziegler, those are 3 very skilled flower farmers in the nation. And then the last thing I'll mention is that most of what I learned came from being part of this Association of Specialty Cut Flower Growers. They're just an excellent organization of people who are really, really good farmers across the country. And many years ago, they launched a mentorship program, and I somehow got lucky to be one of the first spots of getting a mentor. And this lady, Leah, right here, just poured her knowledge into me for 2 to 2.5 years and came to the farm. And she lives up in Cedar Grove, which is near Hillsboro. And I've gotten to go to her farm a few times, and she's come to mine, but we would talk on the phone every week for those 2 years. And she just helped so much. So I can't say enough good things about that association. If anyone is ever looking into stepping from a flower hobby to maybe a flower business, joining this organization, it would be very well worth it. But anyways, I appreciate y'all coming, and hope this has been helpful, and just want to take any last questions before we end up our evening. How did I get started selling to a florist? I had to just show up at one with buckets of things in my car. It was very nerve-wracking. And sometimes they don't really care about your product, and then some of them loved it. So I had to cold call for a little while. And then my best florist customers that I've ended up with, that I have a few that I still will sell the peonies to and occasionally go freelance for, are ones that are just business owners that I knew a friend of a friend, just met them through that and just built a relationship even outside of the flower, like just the flowers, and thus have ongoing friendship with them. And those ladies are how it worked. But in terms of looking at getting customers, you're going to not be not everyone's going to be your ideal client. So to not give up when you get a turned up nose and just go somewhere else. I had a few of those. So, but in the long run, it all worked out. Any other questions? All right, well, thank y'all so much for coming. I really appreciate you being here. You're welcome to come up to me afterward. And then I've got those few props. They were really not for anything except in case I had something trigger my mind and needed to talk about them. But